I'll tell you, this is my theory of life.
Yes, please.
Okay, is that life is about windows and doors. So we all know the expression, if there's a door, open it, it's an opportunity. Go for it, right? But I also believe in windows.
Yeah.
And windows are the little opportunities. And if we can just sometimes open that window and say, wow, there's an opportunity, let me take that or let me try that. And so I think this situation with me and the IU University, it was more of a window, right? It was this window of opportunity. And that's why I was patient.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Joe. Thank you so much for attending our interview today. How are you?
Thank you so much. And I know you're on a tight schedule.
No, I am not.
And you're here in Japan.
Yes, I am
Yay.
from San Francisco. So, Joe, we met at the demo day of Alchemist last week, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and then so you have so unique, interesting role, responsibility. You are the leader at this school, IU. So in English,
Yeah, we usually say Innovation University.
Innovation University in Tokyo, close to Tokyo Skytree.
Right, beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful area.
Yeah.
It's a little bit far from the center, just a little bit. But it is a nice area. Yeah,
Yes.
thank you, yeah.
So Joe, please introduce about yourself. What do you do in Tokyo?
So I'm full-time faculty at this university. We'll say IU from now on.
Yeah, I do.
IU. And I'm the only
Yeah.
non-Japanese faculty member.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And I joined this university from the very beginning.
Before COVID.
Yes, that's right. So we're only in our 5th year now. Brand new.
I see.
Even the paint is new. See, it's very
Yes,
nice.
right.
Very bright. As I said, we're brand new, so we're still developing our final version. What is going to be the final way of the courses and the curriculum and the style that we're going to have. We're still working on it, and I'm quite excited. I'm quite excited. Yeah.
I see. Okay, so Joe, interesting. So first of all, this university, Innovation University, IU, is a specific university
Yes.
to support students to be an entrepreneur.
That's right. That's right. So we only have one degree program,
1 degree.
and that is entrepreneurship. That's it. So all the students take the same course format. They have to do the same classes to get them prepared as an entrepreneur, learn accounting and finance and startups and basically everything. They also go through a program what we call innovation project. So they'll create a startup, and some of the students have been successful. So we've successfully been able to help students launch quite a few startups in just the 5 years that we've been established. So that is also quite a feat. I think it's very interesting too. It's a new category of university that the Ministry of Education created, and we're still trying to see how it's going to be. Again, the final version of the university. So. We are the only one in Japan so far
Only one.
focused on
Special.
entrepreneurship, right? Other schools have courses, programs, certificates and things in entrepreneurship, but we're the only one that's 100% focused, right?
I see. I have tons of questions.
Okay,
So.
bring them on.
Yeah, so first of all, okay, how did you join this IU project from kind of scratch?
Where shall I start? I was in the military, American military. After I retired, I wanted to stay in Japan, and so I started teaching universities. One of the universities I was teaching at hired me, and the students were looking forward to kind of a better time because I guess they had a little bit of hard time before that class. Economics, I believe, is what it was. And so I took over. And then the students really enjoyed it. And so the university kept me on a little bit longer. And one of the students I had eventually graduated. And about a year later, he contacted me and he says, Joe, I'm creating a startup. Can you help me? And I said, sure, why not? Let's do it.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? Yeah. So, we he did all the hard work, of course, and then he started creating programs for design thinking, critical thinking, entrepreneurship mindset for young people. And I would help him to do these workshops. And one of those workshops, we would always have visitors come and look and visit. And one of those workshops, the administrators of this university came to see me. I think they heard somewhere that there was these workshops, so they wanted to know what it was about, right? And they came and visited, and they said, wow, we really enjoyed it, and we liked what you're doing, and we'd like to come back again and meet you and talk. Sure, why not?
Why not?
Yeah, why not, right? So then I heard nothing.
How long?
1 year.
1 year.
1 year.
Okay.
So I thought, okay, they changed their mind, or things change. And suddenly they messaged me and said, can you come and discuss with us what you're doing and talk to us about what you're doing? Sure. Maybe 20 or 30 minutes into the meeting, is this an interview? During the interview, we had a good time. But that's how I got hired. I got hired because they came to visit the workshop.
I see.
And it took another year to be approved by the Ministry of Education. So I had to submit all my records. It took about a year to be approved.
Yeah.
And finally I was approved and hired.
Okay, so after the workshop, you had to wait for 1 year.
Yes.
And then thanks to the meeting in person, they really love your personality. And then, and then after again 1 year.
Yes.
Oh, you were patient, right?
Yes, I was. but I'll tell you, this is my theory of life.
Yes, please.
Okay, is that life is about windows and doors. So we all know the expression, if there's a door, open it. It's an opportunity. Go for it, right? But I also believe in windows. Yeah. And windows are the little opportunities. And if we can just sometimes open that window and say, wow, there's an opportunity, let me take that, or let me try that. And so I think this situation with me and the IU University, it was more of a window, right? It was this window of opportunity. And that's why I was patient. Right? Most people, I think, would just give up and say, oh my gosh, this is taking too long.
I see. Interesting. And then, so you guys started to the first year, right? I believe there are many challenges. So tell us about the biggest challenge in the first year.
Wow, lots of challenges.
Yeah, not only first year. This let's reflect your 5 years, right?
Yes, 5 years. That's right. Well, the biggest challenge for us is creating a name for ourselves. Like, who are we? What do we stand for? What is our core value and our mission and vision? It's just like a startup.
Yes.
Right?
Totally.
Because we are a startup. Yeah. If you think about it, we don't have a long history like big schools. We don't have, super famous professors with big budgets. So we are a startup. I mean, if you think about it. And so in the very beginning, just like a startup, you have to create your final mission, vision, and core value. And so, parents in Japan are very careful about their child's education. So if they don't recognize the name of your school, or they don't know what you stand for, it's hard to recruit students, right? So I think that's one of our biggest challenges. How do we pass the message to the parents and to the young students and to society that we are here trying to do good, right? And then once they understand that, then they can trust us with their children's education. Yeah, that's been one of the biggest challenges. Is how do we communicate that message of who we are? So we met at Alchemist's event, right? The demo day. Now you might be wondering, why was I there? Right? But I go to these events, and you can look up here later. You know, I go to these events in Osaka, Tokyo, and other places, not for myself to enjoy, but to communicate our university and say, this is who we are. We exist, and please, look at us and check us out. So I go to these events to promote the university, not just the building, but I'm talking about the students themselves, right? So that people can say, okay, something is new, something is happening in Japan, not just with all these startup events that are coming, or incubators or accelerators that are coming, but also in the education system is changing. So that's why I go to these events, and then pass out my business cards and connect with people, because I want them to see that Japan really is from the ground up changing.
Yeah, I love this your idea and activity, because as a educator, and also your responsibility is promoting your organization, so that joining some startup event, like a demo day, is good to communicate with real founders, real VC people, venture capital people, and maybe they want to be a kind of I want to give lecture at the university, right? So that as a student, we could listen the real founders super raw Namano story, right? It's super amazing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because what I also do is these startups, like we saw at the event, and other events that I've gone to with Techstars or Plug and Play, etc., is I'll go to the startups and say, hey, you've got a great product, or you've got this great idea. I know you need to test it. Come here and test it with our students, and they'll give you instant feedback, and you're going to get 40, 50, 100 students in one day. And it's just going to help you, but it's going to help my students too, because they can see what is the journey that these startups are taking, and they can ask them, hey, what are the difficulties you're having, or why did you create this startup, or where do you vision yourself in 10 years or 5 years or whatnot. So it helps the students, it helps the startup, it's a win-win.
Yeah, I love that, helping each other. And then, especially Japanese people, including me, we have perfection mindset. If I afraid, if I fail, I afraid. I want to ask, I don't want to, because my English is not great, like that. Don't worry, just do it. Because of as a startup, agile method. Not a perfection, just little by little asking and then getting feedback and then improving. It's Kaizen, right?
Yes. Founders, seeing what's happening in the ecosystem, who are the main and key players, what are the events that are happening. It's so new.
Yeah,
I love it.
I love that.
Really. I'm excited.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Joe, part 1. 1. Opportunities through doors and windows. Joe's philosophy of seeing life as opportunities through doors and windows highlights the importance of noticing small chances and being patient. For instance, Joe's improvement with IU began as a window when university administrators visited one of his workshops. Though it took a year for them to follow up, his openness and patience ultimately led to his unique role at the university. It's amazing. Sometimes we need to be patient and we have to be open. Okay? 2. Challenges of building a new university. Establishing IU was akin to launching a startup. One of Joe's biggest challenges was creating trust and recognition for a brand new institution among cautious Japanese parents and students. To overcome this, Joe actively participates in startup events like Techstars and Alchemist Demo Day to promote IU and its mission, connecting with founders and industry leaders to build credibility. Yeah, this is important. Yeah, we have to be in person, not only online event, I believe. Yeah, this is so great. Okay, 3. Collaborating to drive growth. Joe's proactive approach to collaboration benefits both IU students and startups. For example, he invites startups to test their ideas with IU students, offering them instant feedback while exposing them to real-world entrepreneurial challenges. This mindset model fosters innovation and hands-on learning, breaking traditional educational norms in Japan. Okay, thank you so much for listening to our podcast today. We hope our conversation will help your future and career. If you like today's episode, please subscribe it and then give your like. Okay, next episode is Conversation with Joe Part 2. Thank you. Bye bye.